It's really great to be with all of you. Certainly, if I had my druthers, I would be there with you in person. I'm really glad to be joined in from the other side of the world, but it would be far better to be face to face with you. So hopefully that day will come, if not in glory, maybe sometime sooner if the Lord opens the opportunity. But I'm really glad to be here. I'm glad to share with you some of the research that I've done and the amazing discoveries that that I kind of stumbled into, really. And at the end of the day, it's how God has determined that this would be the time that he would make it clear over 3,450 years later, after all of these events, to bring about evidence to confirm that the histories we read about, such as the Israelites in Egypt for 430 years, we can believe that it's true because there's actual evidence to back this up. I never expected this to happen, and even in a greater sense, I never expected to be the one that God would choose to do that. In his sense of humor, he decided to choose. I think Paul probably was speaking about me when he used these two terms. He said, I'm the least of the saints, and I'm the chief of sinners. And that's who I am. So why God would use me to be the one to bring this to the world, I have no idea. It's completely a divine sense of humor, because he could have chosen thousands who were better. But for whatever reason, I'm the one he chose. And I'm thrilled to share part of this with you. I was studying, actually, for my comprehensive exams for my PhD program. I'd finished my coursework, as we do in Western, in North American countries. We have coursework, so I did my coursework. I was not yet working on my dissertation, but I had to pass these comprehensive exams. And I was supposed to be studying for a comprehensive exam at the moment. And it turns out, as I was looking online for resources, I stumbled into what I knew to be evidence that's connected to the 10th plague on Egypt, in the form of animals, the 4 animals that are listed in Exodus 11 and 12, right at the time of the first Passover, just before the Exodus. And those are cattle, dogs, sheep, and goats. And these burials were done quickly. They were done at the site that many before me have concluded this is the right site where Jacob settled his family. And I basically realized that this was the very time period that's connected with the Exodus, because the pottery that's found inside those graves of those animals that were buried, and most of them, by the way, were sheep and goats, and most of the sheep and goats that were found were in their first year of age, which is exactly what the Hebrew text says in the Bible. Ben Shana is the term, if you know Hebrew, which literally means son of a year, but it's less than a year old. Most of them are sheep and goats. And the little bit of pottery that was found in those mass burials, and they weren't just single burials, but they were mass burials. In other words, multiple animals in one grave. And that pottery connects to Amenhotep II. And it just so happens that years before, in 2006, I published a journal article that was basically demonstrating that the only possible candidate who can work in the 2nd millennium BC for the Exodus Pharaoh is a man named Amenhotep II. And here is this evidence of animals right from the very time of his reign, at the site where people have been saying this is where the Israelites lived, the main city where they lived in Egypt, from the time that Jacob first settled there. So that put me out on a research inquiry, because I asked the question, well, if there's evidence of Israelites in Egypt at the very moment of the Exodus, and they lived there 430 years, you would think that there would be evidence that they lived there for more than just that last year of the 430. So I got on my horse and I rode. I turned over every stone I could find, if I can mix my metaphors here. And next thing you know, it was just, as I like to term it, God dropped me into one gold mine after another. And the discoveries just kept coming. You can read about a lot of them in my 2 books, especially in my newer book, Origins of the Hebrews. which may be available there for purchase. Pastor Karen would know if there are copies there that are available. But in that book, I document all of the literally thousands of hours of research and writing that I did as a result of this first discovery. And the amount of evidence is absolutely overwhelming. And you can read it for yourself and see how the case has been made. But really, this is the first attempt ever made to identify evidence of Israelites in Egypt for that 430 years. Why is that so important? Well, it's like a friend of mine said to me a few months ago, and I think he's dead on right. The Exodus is to the Old Testament what the resurrection is to the New Testament. Because for the people of God, the Jewish people, they went back to that moment where God freed them from slavery. And they knew that that moment, that was the crucible. That's when God essentially got his hands on his people and actually got his hands on their hearts. Yeah, it took a while, and there was a lot of unfaithfulness, there's a lot of doubt, there's a lot of disobedience, there's a lot of idolatry and the worship of foreign gods, pagan gods, stone and wood and metal idols, but God always had a remnant in Israel. Despite what we see with the unfaithfulness, there was always a faithful remnant. And so this story is important not only to Christian believers, but to Jewish people. And we're being told nowadays, I don't know if you're aware of what's going on in the universities, both in Australia, New Zealand, the United States, Western Europe, all over. But anytime these events are spoken about in secular universities, just about without fail, the biblical story and the historicity of the story is doubted, and it's used as a laughingstock because there's never been any evidence. And the argument is, hey, if the Israelites actually lived there in Egypt for 430 years, you'd think by now there would be some evidence if it was that long that they lived there, but there's none. So, and the idea is this: they want to get our children and our grandchildren who are in university to believe and to be persuaded that you can't trust the history that's in the Bible, right? And here's the thing: if you can't trust the history in the Bible, what does that do for the spiritual message? Because really, I mean, God's honor is at stake. And if the Bible, as it's originally written, is full of errors, then why should you trust the spiritual message that's there? So you see the tension that's here. I don't know about your part of the world and how that's gone in the last several decades, but in the United States, I've watched in churches across this country, young people leave up to college and university age, leaving the church in droves. I've watched it. I watched it in Canada too. And it's so discouraging and so disheartening. We need a defense of the historicity of the Bible. Because again, God's honor is at stake. And because people are being persuaded that you can't trust the Bible. So that's what God has called me to, and I hope he's called others too. And I'm just praying that God would send more laborers into this harvest, because it's truly ripe for harvest. There's such important apologetic value here. So with all that, I want to, without any further ado, jump into the slideshow that I have for you, and we'll see how far I can get. I've been known to be a little bit long-winded, so I'm limiting myself to my hour, but I'm not sure if I can get through everything, but we'll do everything that we can. So the topic today for my session with you is the Hebrew invention of the alphabet. So, and I already gave you a little bit of the background, but my research led to this unanticipated discovery that the world's oldest alphabetic script is Hebrew. In other words, there wasn't just evidence of Israelites in Egypt for that 430 years. And that includes, by the way, identifying in Egyptian epigraphical writings. Epigraphical means written inscriptions. that I've identified it, and again, I talk about this in my new book, Origins of the Hebrews, and I argue very powerfully and persuasively there, hopefully to the objective reader. But I've identified Joseph, his two sons Ephraim and Manasseh, one of Manasseh's obscure sons named Shechem that you only read about in Joshua chapter 17 verse 2, nowhere else in the Bible, and all of those for sure, and almost 100% for sure, but maybe a little bit of doubt, but very close to 100% sure, Jacob himself, in an inscription that I'll show you in a moment. So with all of that included in it is those Israelites, as God was growing the nation in Egypt, they invented the alphabet. So after resolving the disputed letters among the 22-letter alphabet, I translated 15 proto-consonantal Hebrew inscriptions, and that sounds fancy, but it's very simple. Proto means first, consonantal means it only consists of consonants, no vowels. So the original alphabet, picture this, had no vowels. It was all the equivalent of capital letters, and there were no dividers between words. So imagine reading that kind of text, and imagine in our day deciphering that kind of writing. So it was a very, very difficult process for those two reasons alone, although there were other reasons. And these inscriptions date between 1840 and 1446 BC. The year the Israelites entered Egypt is 1876 BC. So 36 years after they enter Egypt, we have our first full-blown Israelite consonantal or alphabetic inscription. So within this corpus of texts, 3 of the inscriptions name biblical figures. Osnath, I don't know if you know that name or not, but she's the wife of Joseph. She's named posthumously, meaning after she was already deceased. Ahisamach, another obscure name. That guy is the father of a man named Oholiab. And for those of you who love the Old Testament, you may know that name, Oholiab. He's one of the 2 men God himself appointed to build or construct the tabernacle in the desert for that 40 years after the Exodus and before the conquest. And also, third, and this will shock you, and it should shock you. It shocked me, and I'm not making this up, folks. I didn't find in the text what I wanted it to say. That was my commitment. Whatever the text said, that was my promise to myself and to God. I would translate whatever is there, good, bad, or indifferent. Moses is mentioned in one of the inscriptions. So we'll look at those 3 inscriptions if we get to it, if we have time. So what about the publicizing of this research? And think about it. If God's behind this, right? If he raised me up to accomplish this greater purpose for his kingdom and for both for the church and for the Jewish people, and I'm convinced that's the case, then you would think that God would find a way to make it apparent to all, or as many as possible. And I've been amazed in these years how God has brought this to people's attention. It began with, once I first published the book and could go public on it, there was a big news service in the United States that picked up the story, Fox News, and it was on their main web page. They have one main article and then a lead article, and then they have 3 under it. And it was one of the 3 that was right under the lead article for that day for Fox News. So that's the first way that happened. But I'll just mention a couple other things. Pastor Karen mentioned this series called Patterns of Evidence by a filmmaker in Minneapolis, Minnesota in the United States named Tim Mahoney. There's his face. And in 2014, in the fall, he put out a film to theaters, at least in the United States, some theaters, and it's very expensive to put a Christian documentary film in theaters, but he did for a couple days, and it was a great turnout, as it goes for being as difficult to publicize it as you would think a Christian film is. But that first film, I couldn't be a part of it because I was working on my PhD at the University of Toronto, and the discoveries couldn't be public. I couldn't even tell my committee members of my PhD committee because they certainly would have stopped me from getting my PhD. No doubt about it. So I kept it secret. But that first film came out on the Exodus itself, Patterns of Evidence. on the Exodus. And then my book came out in the end of 2016, really in the beginning of 2017. The first printing sold out. It's on the second printing now. It was printed in December, and it can be bought from my publisher in Jerusalem, Carta. And I'm glad that God gave the book a Jewish, a Hebrew publisher. It's called Carta, which means map. So I'm really thrilled with what God has done with that. So that book has these discoveries in it, and all the gory details. And I had to I tried to strike a balance between making it readable for the average person and defensible against attack from scholars. So it's kind of going back and forth between scholarly world and normal non-specialist world. And I did my best. But it had to be good. It had to be sound. It had to be defensible. So, yeah, I won't go through what's in the book, but we'll look at a little bit of what's in there. Then in 2019, that Patterns of Evidence, second film, The Moses Controversy, came out. In between the first film, and once my book came out and before this movie came out, Tim Mahoney was going to write or prepare the second film on Sinai, Mount Sinai. Where was it and what happened there, and do we have any certainty we've got the right site and all of that? But then he found out about my research and he contacted me, and he literally changed what the second film was going to be. He decided it needs to be about Moses. There's this Moses inscription in there, and this gives evidence that Moses had a written Hebrew script in his hands that he could use for the writing of the first 5 books of the Bible, because that was always a big question mark. In what language did Moses write? Because we have no evidence that the Israelites had a script to write with. Whenever you say the Exodus was, for me, it's the middle of the 15th century BC. For others, it's the 13th century BC. There was no evidence of it. Well, now there is. In fact, the script goes back almost 400 years before Moses would have been doing his writing. And that's astonishing. So the Hebrew script was long in their hands. All right, moving on. Let's connect the Israelites to this first alphabetic script. So again, I do all of the hard work for that in my book. So, let the book speak for itself. Published by New Creation in Nashville, Tennessee, United States in 2021. And I want to just kind of get you into some of the fun stuff now. And it all goes back to this site. This is where the Israelites live, if you can follow my cursor there, right here. So this is the Nile Delta here in northern Egypt, and this is lower Egypt, right? And then upper Egypt is here, and middle Egypt is here. So in lower Egypt, on the eastern side, or in the eastern Nile Delta, right on the Pelusiac branch of the Nile, is this site called Avaris. It's already occupied early in the 12th dynasty. That's the dynasty of Joseph's day. So there were people living there before the Israelites showed up. And I'll just give you a quick summary. Avaris covers more than 165 hectares in size. It's located about 65 kilometers northeast of Cairo. So that's a modern city, of course, in an area that the Bible refers to as the land of Goshen. During most of the second millennium BC, Avaris served as the hub that connected Asia to Africa. So think about it. Where did God have the Israelites live? Well, you know about Israel, and that's right there. That's that land bridge between Africa and Asia. Perfectly strategic site. And while they were in Egypt, they were at the equivalent, a perfectly strategic site, the site of Avaris. Why? Because it connected Africa and Asia both by sea and by land, controlling the primary flow of traffic and commerce between these two great continents. So it's like a port city. It's a port city for the maritime traffic, for the ships coming in and out of the boats. And it's also the end of the line. If you were to go, this map doesn't show it, but there's a main road called the Great Trunk Road. In the New Testament era, it's known as the Via Maris, or the Way of the Sea. And it goes all the way down through this area and into Egypt, and it dumps off. It ends right here at Avaris. There it is. Once the road crosses Wadi El Arish here, it's no longer called the Great Trunk Road, but it's called, right at this point, it's called the Way of Horus, or the Road of Horus. Horus is the name of one of the Egyptian gods. He's the king of the gods. So it's the road of the king of the gods that you would take all the way into Avaris, and it ends here. So it's the perfect place for them to be strategically. And with God, it's always strategic. The Israelites were fortunate enough to be positioned at the most strategic and ideal location in all of Africa. No doubt about it, because it connects Africa with both Asia and with Europe. All right, and this is a little bit more kind of a blown up image. So as we're coming up the Nile northeast, if you will, to the northeast, this Pelusiac branch of the Nile passes right by Avaris here. This is Per or P. Some of you may know it as P. Ramesses, but it's Per Ramses, the house of Ramses. In the 13th dynasty, Ramses II builds his capital there. And really, the Egyptians saw things differently than we do today. They didn't see it as separate from Avaris that was abandoned and in this area. Again, it was occupied during the 12th dynasty and all the way down through Moses' time, the 18th dynasty, but it's abandoned. And then in the 13th century BC, the 1200s, about a little over a kilometer and a half away, Kantir is built as the capital for Ramses II. And that's why we see the word Ramses in the biblical text. And my book will argue why we can still believe that the Exodus happened in the 15th century BC, even though in the text we read Ramesses, right? So the book answers that very, very carefully. So that's the site, that's the location. And the Israelites settled here. And this is called area F1 by the archaeologists. And you see this area of excavation in black here. There was a major excavation done here. And what I call the Egyptianized Asiatic residence was here. It's a massive, it's like a mansion, room after room after room. And it was built during the second Asiatic occupational phase, which in my new book I connect with the lives of Joseph's two oldest sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, because when Jacob was about to die and Joseph brought his two sons with him to visit his dying father, one of the things that Jacob did is he stole Joseph's two oldest sons from him and his family and said, these two have to live here with me. And it was the most strategic move I can even think of in biblical history, because the young boys, their uncles, needed someone to connect them with this new land, because they couldn't speak the language, they didn't know the culture, they didn't know the religion, they didn't know how commerce works in Egypt. They would be dead to rights. But Jacob was smart enough to bring in two young men who not only had the bank account of Pharaoh at their disposal as the sons of the vizier, the second in command in all of Egypt, but they had all of the cultural cues. They knew the language, both written and both in spoken form and in written form. And with that, the two boys would have, however long it took, I like to envision it like this. They would have looked around and walked up to their uncles and said, hey, uncles, we write in hieroglyphic Egyptian. What do you write in? What do you write Hebrew in? And the uncles would have looked at each other and said, we don't have a script. We don't write. And the boys would have said, well, maybe we need to do something about this to change it. So that led to the invention of the alphabet. It was purely practical. And they knew they needed to invent a script, that it wasn't just for the scribal class or the aristocrats or the intellectuals, but these men, the Hebrews, they were sheep herders. So they had to give them a script in which, a script that they could understand and comprehend and write and read in a simple fashion. And that's the beauty of the alphabet. It connected pictures with words. And we'll look at that here in a moment. But I want to mention too quickly, there's a temple here. So the Egyptians lived here in an area called R1. They built a temple here right on the edge of the Pelusiac branch of the Nile. So the water was rolling right by here. They built a temple here, and an inscription was found in that temple. It's fascinating. And it's from year 5 of the famine, which I prove in my new book. And I've translated it in my book. It's in an appendix. It's the first time it's ever been translated accurately. It was attempted once in 1959, but it really wasn't a very good job of translation. The first minor of my PhD was Egyptian language. I had 3 years of Middle and Late Egyptian. So I translated that, put it in my book, and it demonstrates and it testifies to a time of incredible harmony between the Egyptian priests who were there and the Israelites who were there, the foreigners. And they worked together to build a dike. Why? Because this is the time of the Great Famine. We're 5 years in, right? And the water level would have been very low, extremely low, and it barely was at a trickle, so it wasn't passing by the temple anymore. So what they did is they built a dike to connect the northern face of the temple there, the Egyptian temple, to the Pelusiac branch of the Nile. That's exactly how it reads. And that stela, it's called, that stone inscription, is a commemoration of this event. All right, and here it is. This is called the Esbet Rushdie stela. So that's one of the things that one of the inscriptions I've translated in my book. And here it is in a form that we can look at and understand. It's a drawing of it. That's not my drawing, but I translated it as pretty much as you see it. It's a very good representation of what's actually in the inscription. So that all of this, I translated it. It reads from top to bottom and right to left. With hieroglyphics, you always read it from the direction in which the animals or the people, where's a person that I can point to here? Here's a person, here's a person. From the direction that they're looking this way. So you read it this way. And it always, if there's a choice between top to bottom or bottom to top, it's never bottom to top, it's always top to bottom. So it has to be translated this row, then this row, then this row, etc. So a couple important things in here. Right here, let's see, I'm going to move that. Right here, this says Renal Year 5, and this is the name of the king, Senwosret, who is, as we know him, Sesostris. He's not just any Sesostris, he's Sesostris the third. And in my book, I attempt to prove to the reader that Sesostris the third is the famine pharaoh. And oddly enough, his reign began in the very transitional year between the 7 years of abundance and the 7 years of famine. So right in that transitional year, he takes the throne. And so this stela is in, you see it right here, in year 5 of his reign, which means we're 4.5 or whatever, 4 and change years into the 7-year famine that we read about in the Bible. And then this hieroglyph here, this is called a determinative, or it's a hieroglyph used as a determinative, and that is an Asiatic person. And Israel, as we know it today, is in Asia. Whether you know that or not, it's part of Asia, and so this is an Asiatic person. And this is the name that I'm convinced is Jacob, by the way. The king, and it means the king of the gods is in his son. That's what it means. That's the word for son. His, right there, his. So anyway, the king of the gods is in his son, and that determinative shows that this person is an Asiatic. And then there's this person's name, which in Egyptian is Heri, and then there's a house there with a doorway open on the first floor, if you will. And this is a very rarely used hieroglyph of a person. And the person's arms are 90 degrees at the elbow, both raised upward, and it can mean one of two things: jubilation, as in celebration, or high, as in, you know, if you're 2 meters tall, you're extremely high. And also, it could mean high in another way, in an abstract sense. So with this name here, I'm sorry, this isn't a name, that's a title. The name starts here. With this title, Heri Per, and Per, that's our word house, Heri Per, and this hieroglyph, it's showing that it's a person who's really high. And what the office is here, the title, it's head of the household. And that's one of the very important terms that's used of the person who ran the king's house. Head of the household. And so this is the head of the household, and it's someone who's very high up. Either he's 2 meters tall or he's very high up in position, in rank. And as I try to prove in my book, this is indeed Joseph. So notice this. First thing to notice, see that house right there? This is drawn very inaccurately as hieroglyphics goes. The Egyptian scribes never, ever, ever, ever drew a house like this. This is a square. They always made a rectangle here. So it's not politically correct, if you will, to use the vernacular. And second thing is this hieroglyph as a determinative is never used with head of the household anywhere else unless it's with a foreigner in mind. And it's very rare to begin with. So this is one of the rare uses. That's the first, the oldest attested use. And again, I'm suggesting to you that this is Joseph under his name Sa Sobek. And I won't go into that, but the book does. So with all of that, we can move ahead to some more of the evidence. Then, at this site right here I haven't read, down in Sinai, it's called Sirabit El Khadim. Okay, obviously you see this is the Sinai Peninsula. This is the Gulf of Suez. It's part of the Red Sea, right there, the Gulf of Suez. And so Avaris, where the Israelites were located, was here. So there would be annual or occasional trips, expeditions. And actually, it was a lucrative industry to extract turquoise from the mines down here in southwestern Sinai. So they would send teams from Egypt, or yearly teams roughly, down into Sinai. It was a dirty job, and they would go down here and mine turquoise and come back and sell it, and make a lot of money. So this is one of the industries that the Israelites capitalized on to become wealthy, as the Bible at the end of Genesis clearly states. So Serabit, it's this site of one of several turquoise mines in southwestern Sinai that were exploited by the Egyptians who traveled there for these expeditions. This continued from early on, from the early dynasties through Dynasty 12 and all the way to Dynasty 28. The early ones began at this nearby site called Maghara. God used this industry to make and to bless the Israelites financially. So when the Israelites and the Egyptians would go there on annual expeditions, they would record what happened there at the site during that year's expedition. And here we see this really strange use of this jubilant man or high person hieroglyph. It's used as the first pictograph in a name. And here, the final hieroglyph here, this is a seated person. This is showing us that's a human being. That this person, that's how you pronounce his name. That's a human being. And this goes with it. But the Egyptians never in their history, before this, during this time, or after this, never used this hieroglyph to start a word, because it's never pronounced. It only comes at the end of a word as a determinative. So this is a really strange use that it begins, and this is dated to year 6 of Amenemhat III, and that's the son of Sostres III, the famine pharaoh. And I try to prove in my book that it's year 1 of Amenemhat III's reign that 2 important things happen, or if not 3. Jacob dies in that year. Sostres III hands the baton to his son, so his son Amenemhat III sits on the throne with him, but starts to handle all the affairs of Egypt, and he goes off into semi-retirement. And then the third thing is that Ephraim and Manasseh, the sons of Joseph, moved to their grandfather's homestead, the site of Avaris, to live among their uncles in year 1, that very same year. So here it is, 5 years later, and somebody is writing this really strange thing that you only see on that stela that Joseph wrote at Avaris with this jubilant man hieroglyph in a very strange fashion. And then here's 7 years later, and look at this. Look what we have here. Peri pair, right? Remember that? Peri pair with this this politically incorrect house that's a square instead of a rectangle. And it's the jubilant man. So somebody carbon copied exactly what we see at Avaris, the homestead of the Israelites, several decades earlier. Who is this person doing this? And again, I go on in my book to try to prove it's Manasseh, the oldest son of Joseph, under the Egyptian name Chebeded, which, by the way, means he who was disfavored. What happened to Manasseh? That he would lose favor. Well, Jacob himself, when it was time to give the blessings, what did he do with the two oldest sons of Joseph? Instead of giving the birthright to the oldest son Manasseh, he instead gave it to the secondborn, to Ephraim. What did he do in effect? He took the blessing away from Manasseh, he who was disfavored. That's exactly what happened to Manasseh. And what's fascinating about this? Nobody else in Egypt's history, before or after this person who went on these expeditions, had the name Chebeded, he who was disfavored. It's used of one person alone in all of Egypt's history, as far as we know. And again, I'm convinced that that's Manasseh. And I argue all of the reasoning for it in the book. So here's another occasion. And then here is another hairy pair with the hieroglyph. But notice here we have a square, right, for the house. It's a full square, whereas here we have a square, but it has the doorway open like the Egyptians would do with their hieroglyphs. But this one, the doorway is closed, and that's not totally non-Egyptian. That's another form of political incorrectness. But they do make it into the guy does make it into a rectangle. Chebeded, he who was disfavored, makes it into a rectangle. But here, he makes it into a square. Well, that's going to come in handy, because at the site, several years later, year 18 of Amenemhat III. So where were we? Well, this actually was the year 20, but it's between this inscription and this inscription, right? There's this stela, and now you can see what they're like. What we were looking at was just a little bit of it. It's 8 to 9 feet tall. I'm not sure how tall that is. Maybe over 2 meters, I think, in the metric system. But at the bottom, so the annual expedition is recounted here. That's very, very common. It's very simplistic. They're just telling about what they did, what they found there, and what happened during their time. But it's our focus what was drawn at the bottom. Every time this guy named Chebeded would be the one to inscribe the stela recounting the year's the expedition's events, he would put down here an autobiographical statement up here in hieroglyphics, and then he would put the same drawing. What's that drawing? This dates to 1842 BC. There's an up-close version of it. It's a man, and that's Chebeded himself. We know that from one of the other inscriptions, seated on a donkey. A donkey is not Egyptian. That's Asiatic. And we know from the Bible that Jacob's family had donkeys. This is a young boy leading, if you will, with this rope, leading the donkey. And you can't see it too well, but there's another young man here. So I had to translate this caption because it was really important. In a publication in the 1950s, the foremost authority with Egyptian hieroglyphics, Alan Gardner, British man, he translated this much of it, which is Ichenwi, which means Levantine people from the Levant. And again, the Levant is ancient Israel, Canaan, Phoenicia, and Syria. That's the Levant, right? So it's Levantine people. That's the noun. The adjective comes second always. And there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them on this expedition. So there's 6 people from the Levant. And then right here is where it gets really important. And I want you to see it now because this represents how I've drawn it in. It's Ivrei, and then this is an N, the N sound, meaning of. Ivrei, Hebrews, of, and then this is the site name. It's Bethel, and then that hieroglyph means beloved. So it's 6 people from the Levant, Hebrews, of Bethel, the beloved. Isn't that amazing? What was Bethel, and why was it beloved? When Joseph was thrown into the pit by his brothers, and then off they went with caravanners to be sold in slavery in Egypt. Where were the Israelites living? They were living in Canaan. The city was called Bethel, house of God. Isn't that amazing? So it became the beloved homestead of the Israelites. And that's what's recorded here on this inscription. So whoever wrote this, his home city is Bethel, right? Whose home city was Bethel? Jacob and all of his family. Wow. So we now have an inscription that mentions Hebrews right there, Ivrei, Hebrews, that dates to 1842 BC. What's the significance of that? And here it is, and you can look at all the details in my book. It was thought that the oldest reference to Israelites was this Merneptah stele, which dates to about 1219 BC, because we have this mention here of Israel mentioned in the stela. So by the 13th century BC, Israelites were there in Canaan. And then in 2010, a publication by a German scholar demonstrated that we have this also. This is a hieroglyphic inscription mentioning Israelites. And his epigrapher dated it based on analogies with other inscriptions to the reign of Amenhotep II. You remember who he is? He is the Exodus Pharaoh. And so this represents captured Israelites in the year of the Exodus that takes place in year 7 of Amenhotep II's reign, when he goes into Canaan on a slave raid and he captures 100,000 slaves. You can read all about it in my new book. And 3,600 of them are Apiru. Apiru is the Egyptian word for Habiru. Habiru is the Akkadian word for the Hebrew word Ivrei, or Hebrews. So these are Israelites commemorated on this what's called the Berlin pedestal. It's basically an advertisement saying that the Pharaoh captured people from all of these nationalities in Canaan when he went and took 100,000 people as slaves. If he's being honest, that's what the number says in Egyptian. You can doubt it. You can say it's less. It's argued by scholars, but that's what he claims, Amenhotep II. In the very year of the Exodus, in November, and the Exodus happens in the month of April. And again, I talk about that in the book. So now this inscription, what I call affectionately the Hebrews, the Hebrews inscription, now the oldest attested inscription verifying that there are Israelites mentioned goes back to 1842 BC with this mention here. Okay, now we move on to connecting the alphabetic script. So how did the script work? Let's say we want to create a script with English, right? Let's say we speak to one another in English, but we've never written anything down, and we want to create a script, and we're going to do it like the Israelites did. So we draw something like this, and my artistic talent ended in about the 3rd grade. Okay, that's as far as it went. So that's my version of a boat. So you see a boat, and in your mind you're thinking boat, but all you pronounce is the B sound, because the B sound begins the word boat, and you have to insert the vowel yourself, because the Israelites didn't use vowels. They didn't write vowels at all. So we have a B sound, and then there's a next letter, and that's it's a door. So the door starts with a D. So we have a B and a D with some vowel in between the two. So there's our D. Then we have another letter, and that's the same as the first one. So that's another B sound, a B, and this, probably you can guess, is a gate. So the gate makes the G sound. So what have we just done? What have we created? Well, here's the question, 2 questions. What does this say, and how many words are here? Well, we can dispute it because there's no separation anywhere between the letters. So your guess is as good as mine, what the writer intended. But if we do it, we make this script in the acrophonic fashion as the Israelites did. We put a noun first and an adjective second. So we can have a bed, right? A bed. I'm inserting the short E class vowel here, bed. And then B and G is big. So we have a big bed, exactly as the Hebrews invented it. So that's how the acrophonic system works. And in my first book, I have this alphabetic chart that goes through modern form of the Hebrew alphabet. And here's how I'm suggesting the earliest, Manasseh and Ephraim together probably brainstormed and came up with an alphabet. This is how they originally wrote it. And this is the hieroglyph that it's based on. This is how to write that letter as you speak it out, the what's behind the actual alphabetic letter. So that's a door, right? That's an Egyptian way of drawing a door. So you see the door, the Hebrew word is delet. So there it is in Hebrew, and then I write it here, delet for door. This is as it's attested in Joseph's lifetime, in Moses' lifetime, this column, and this column is in the period of the monarchy, when you have kings ruling in Israel and Judah. So, and that's the bottom of the chart, and now we can move on and get to the really fun stuff with the little time we have left. So I want to look with you at one inscription. Well, at least one inscription. This is, let's see, how much time do we have? 8:47. Yeah, let's do this one. So in 1834 BC, an inscription was composed at a site called Wadi El Hol. Where's Wadi El Hol? Well, it's right down here on the bend of the Nile River. It's way upstream in the higher ground or higher country in Upper Egypt to the south, because the Nile River, it's one of those few rivers in the world that runs from south to north and dumps into the Mediterranean. So Wadi El Hol is here. And it was an Egyptian outpost that was used to protect against basically hooligans or attackers who would come from south of them in Egypt, in ancient Nubia. And so it was located right in this area here. And there was graffiti there. And among the graffiti, there were two alphabetic inscriptions. So Hebrews must have, or at least one Hebrew, must have traveled there just 4 decades or so after Jacob settled his family in Egypt. And here is, looks like it's diagonal, but it's technically a vertical inscription. And so as a vertical inscription, it has to read top to bottom. And there's the end of it, the wording. And now this represents, after I've drawn in electronically with PowerPoint actually, I've drawn in all the important strokes that are part of this inscription and the drawing that goes with it. Hebrew was just the same as ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. If there was a drawing and there was text near it, the text always, always, always relates to the drawing. And that's the case here. This is not a snow angel for those of you who go to places where there's snow and make yourself a little snow angel. That's not what this is. This is the Egyptian Ankh sign. Some people wear it today as a necklace around their neck. And basically it means life, right? It means life. And so what does the inscription mean? So once I've drawn in all of the strokes I need, I remove the picture. So the picture is now gone, and now I can work with it as an epigrapher, one who deciphers ancient inscriptions or inscriptions in general. And so I had to decipher all of this, finding out where the words start and where the words end and what was the meaning and so forth. So at the end of the day, here's what I come up with. And the red lines represent breaks in words. So this is where the word breaks take place. And here's how it reads. Surrounding the crooked one, your afflictor, implied predication is, it's like a pause, right? We're waiting, drum roll please, is whom, or is who? Who is it that surrounds the crooked person, right? The unrighteous person, the one who's doing evil deeds? Your afflictor? Who is that person who surrounds that evil person? It's El, right there, El. El is the Semitic, and used throughout the peoples of Canaan and the Levant. El is the name used of the king of the gods. In fact, Moses uses it a number of times. It's a Canaanite pagan word for the king of the gods, usually of the biggest, most important god in the pantheon. And that god is El. So the Israelites embrace the usage of that word. It doesn't mean they embrace the pantheon of the Canaanites or that Canaanite city. All it means is they take the concept and use it for themselves. The Canaanites see this God as the king of the gods. We see the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as the king of the gods. That's who is the real king of the gods. That's who's the real El. So they used this term among themselves already in 1834 BC. Isn't that amazing? So El, God, is at the center of all of this. I won't go into the meaning. There's a really cool meaning behind all of this. I go into that in my book. But just to give you at least one or two more inscriptions, we'll march on with the time that I have left. So we'll move to this next inscription, Sinai 376. And this dates to approximately 1772 BC. Joseph dies in about 1805, 1804 BC, so he's dead for several decades. And this inscription dates to, again, several decades later. It's at a site called Wadi Nasib, which was it's the water source for Serebit al-Khadim, that place in Sinai where they did took these annual or so expeditions to extract turquoise. So, and here you can see the inscription here. It's published in the 1960s by a German scholar named Gerster. And so what I've done is I've filled in now both where the letters actually go. You can see it in a whitish tint. And then the blackish areas where there's either a flaw in the stone or a place, where there is no writing. I filled that in with gray. And now I take away the picture, and that's the inscription. It reads top to bottom, and in this case, right to left. So these are columns, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then one final letter in a fifth column. So here it is. And here's how it reads. The house of, the vineyard of, Asnath, and its innermost room were engraved. They have come to life. Right there. They have come to life. The house of the vineyard of Asnath and its innermost room were engraved. They have come to life. So this is speaking about a summer house where the garden is. I lived 10 years in Siberia, Russia. Most of my Russian friends had what's called a dacha. It's a summer garden house. And they would work on their garden all summer long. They'd live there among the stalks, among the plants, so that they could watch over it, weed it every day, protect it, water it, keep it from animals, from people, thieves. So that's what you have here. It's a house in the middle of the vineyard so that the vintner can control the grapes and the plants in the vineyard. So there's a house there, and it was beautified. How was it beautified? By engraving the house itself and the innermost room. And what's fascinating here is this. It's beautiful terminology that's found as used of the Israelite temple by the later biblical writers. So what the Jews call the first temple, we call it sometimes the Solomonic temple. It uses terms like Beit, house of, and Devir, which is the innermost room. We know of it as the Holy of Holies. The Holy of Holies. And they use this word. Solomon carved all of the temple's walls with engravings. So these two are the same words. This one is a verbal form. That's a nominal form. So it's a verb and a noun, but the same exact word. Well, all three of those words are used in Sinai 376 from hundreds of years earlier. Beit, house of. Devir, innermost room. Engraved or carved, used of that dacha, that summer house, to oversee the work that's done on that vineyard. So this verifies, right, that we're talking about the same kinds of terms used by the Hebrews of their temple. It's used of this house, and houses were 3-room houses, just like the temple was. a tripartite building, a three-part building, 3 rooms. So this is absolutely incredible. All right, with our 4 minutes left, I want to skip ahead to the inscription that you'll enjoy probably the most, Sinai 361. I didn't believe it when I first saw it. Here it is. This inscription right here, Sinai 361. This photograph is a great black and white photograph published in 1932. So it's almost 100 years old, 90 years old. And here I've done my work with it. Here I pull away the photograph. And here you can see the juicy end of it. So it's once again, a vertical inscription. Most of the ones we've been looking at are vertical. Many of them are horizontal. So it's vertical. That column is read first. That column is read second. That column is read third. And that column is read fourth. They're actually, it's like you could break this in half and there's symmetry. It's a long vertical column and a short column. Then a long vertical column, then a short column. So there's beauty here. There's symmetrical beauty in the way that it was written. And it's probably not by chance that it ends up looking that way. So how does it read? Our bound servitude had lingered. Now this inscription dates to much later. It's from Serebet el-Khadim, when Israelites are working there in Moses' lifetime, but under compulsion, because they're slaves at this point. They've been slaves for, 114 or 116 years. It's in my book. I forget now which one it is. But in Moses' day, they're already slaves. Our bound servitude had lingered. We continued in this mode of being slaves, servants to the king. Then something happened. What happened? And here's the word here, Moshe. Moshe then provoked astonishment. What were the 10 plagues? Astonishing actions that only could have been performed by someone who could suspend the laws of nature or stretch them to their extreme beyond what normally happens in human life. Moses then provoked astonishment. And then it says, it is a year of astonishment because of the lady. Most biblical scholars are convinced, and I agree with them, that the 10 plagues on Egypt, that's not something that happened in a day or a week, but that it took a year to happen. And this early Hebrew writer, just before the Exodus, writes, it is a year of astonishment. And this guy Moses, he's the one behind it all. He's provoked astonishment for the people. And then they attribute it to whom? Not to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but to the lady. That is a reference, as I prove in both my books, that is a reference to a pagan deity. And it's right here, Baalat. That's the she version, the female consort of Baal, who later is worshipped as the storm god or as the god of fertility in Canaan. So his wife, his idol goddess is Baalat, and there it is. So this Hebrew writer is ascribing credit to these astonishing things, the 10 plagues in my interpretation, assigning credit not to God, but to this pagan deity. And this is a verification of the later prophets who say, and quoting God himself, and God says, when you were infants or in your youth back in Egypt, you served idols. Here it is. Here is proof of God's statement that they were idol worshipers. So all of this demonstrates that it's the Israelites who are the inventors of the alphabet. And there are amazing inscriptions that attest to this. We've only looked at a few, but it's a new day, folks. It's a new day. Now we can stand up against our critics. Now we can stand up against the professors who are spewing evil against the Bible and against God, and we can fight back with strong evidence that Israelites indeed were in Egypt, and that they are the originators of the alphabet that worked its way down to you and me and what we have today with our Latin alphabet that we read and write with English. Thank you very much.